In the living room of my family's house in the suburbs, there used to be a side table nestled between the two couches, all coming together to form an L shape. I attribute many of my early memories to this corner of the living room. On this side table was the family laptop, and during the early 2000s, when our only way of communicating with the rest of our relatives in Turkey was through MSN video chat, we would all squish into the one corner of the couch that allowed us to be in the webcam's view. It was family tradition to gather on the weekends in the mornings to talk to aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, people living in a land so distant from us that I sometimes wondered if they really existed. I would see their faces in a small rectangle on a screen, but for a young girl, it was hard to imagine them in person. Yet despite being apart from my homeland, I felt a part of me was together with the people back home. The duality of my identity stems from this connection that I have somehow been able to keep with a place and culture far, far away. Family that was thousands of miles to the east, but nevertheless, the deep inner connections that transcended the physicality of this universe would ensure that we were apart, together. And little did I know that these mundane experiences of a young immigrant girl would teach her a big lesson about human connection over a decade later. This lesson would help her cope with the sudden change that occurred in the world. So let's take a leap forward in time. March 2020. I'm sure you know where the story is going. I'll never forget sitting in my bed, studying for my midterm at my off-campus apartment, just hoping that Boston College would cancel classes for 2 weeks. All I wanted at that moment were those extra 2 weeks to study for that oh-so-dreaded exam. When I got the notification that classes were canceled, I remember feeling joy and excitement. Yet these feelings quickly turned a corner as a few weeks into quarantine, I began to experience that feeling that many of us felt during quarantine. Dread. Existential dread. That realization of not knowing what will become of you. Will I ever see my friends again? Will the world ever return back to normal? More than a year after the fact, these questions may seem a bit dramatic. Those utterly dreadful thoughts and emotions ate away at my insides, because suddenly it felt like I was living through history that I only dared read in textbooks or fiction novels. Suddenly, it was reality. Of course, in this hectic world filled with the deafening quiet, we had to continue to function as a normal human being. I mean, that's all we know, right? At this point, it seemed like everyone I knew was trying to figure out how to cope with this sudden turn in reality. And I remember feeling lost in a new world completely different than the one I lived in just a few weeks prior. I tried to live my life as I normally would, yet the hole in my life from not having my usual human-to-human interactions was simply too big to ignore. It was during this time that all over social media, you heard about people mourning the new normal as a result of this round thing with red spikes all over our screens. This thing keeping people from seeing their family, their friends. At some point during all of this, I began to realize how funny it was that I would only talk about being kept from my friends because the only family I had in the entirety of the Western Hemisphere was with me. The rest, thousands of miles away, were always apart from me, yet together. So in the midst of this existential crisis, which became an all too familiar of a feeling, I took a few lessons from the experiences of a young immigrant girl and began to apply it to the current life of a college junior in the middle of a pandemic. So I stopped to think, I reflected, I wrote. And it became clear to me that the deeper, unexplainable connections that we build with the people we care about It's these connections that form a foundation that is strong enough to overcome the difficulties of distance. My family and I didn't need to physically be together in order to talk about the details of our life or be up to date with each other. We didn't need to be side by side to feel together. And I realized that if I could do this at the tender ages of my youth, with people that I only saw a few times in person during my entire life, what was going to keep me from sustaining my relationships with the people I cared about in this new mess of a world? You see, the term apart together illustrates that our human tendency to find comfort and community amongst each other is not simply dependent on factors such as how often we see each other or our physical distance from one another. This sounds simple, but it is only when faced with a pandemic that changed the course of history that I truly began to accept this concept. Human connection goes beyond the explainable and into a deeper level where community is achievable while still being apart. I personally lived out this lesson as an immigrant who grew up far away from her family, yet was able to stay connected to them and her culture. Many of us have also lived out this lesson as we experienced in some way or another being away from a loved one. Now, this could have been during pre-COVID times or during the pandemic itself. But nevertheless, distance doesn't always entail a disconnect. Apart together exemplifies the human-to-human connections we make that seem to go beyond the regular dimensions of life. It means being able to keep close with a loved one, regardless of the means by which you do so. In the simplest sense, it emphasizes the power of inner human relations. So while I naively stressed out about not being able to physically see my friends that live just 10 miles away, my entire life I had built a connection with my family that transcended the limits of distance. So during the pandemic, I adapted, as all of us had to do. Reflecting on this lesson about human connection from my childhood, I worked to actively change my mindset when it came to the people I missed. Remember those Zoom movie nights? Or the group FaceTime calls where everyone constantly talked over one another until the chorus of voices practically melted into one? Maybe it was a heartfelt text you wrote to a friend you realized you hadn't spoken to in a while. Perhaps it was an email to a professor or employer checking in to make sure they were okay. A text to a neighbor to let you know if they needed anything. Those small moments amongst the anxiety and panic that made you feel like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. I lived through all of this, and I'm sure many of you did as well. And it were those small moments that helped me break away from the dangerous thought that I had to physically be with my loved ones to feel comfort. It were those small moments that allowed me to realize that even through the worst of human times, the unexplainable connections that we have with the very people we care about allow us to be apart together. So in the next few months or years until the pandemic is officially over, and even throughout the rest of your life, when you find yourself away from loved ones, I urge you to remind yourself of this very special part of human nature. This special aspect of our being that allows for us to experience the joys and pains of human relationships in a letter, a Zoom call, or a text, despite the circumstances separating us. And I urge you to remember that these unexplainable connections that we have with our loved ones will endure through the hardest of trials so long as you believe in the power of human connection. Thank you.